So how does it play out? I'm going to do this part pretty briefly, I think. If you were a betting person, right, if you were a betting man or woman, you would not have bet on the Americans. Right? If you were a betting man or woman, you would not have bet on the Americans. Britain was Golden State with KD, and the Americans were Toronto without Kawhi, right? This would not have been, you're like, oh man, they're going to kill those farmers, those poor guys, right? You would not have expected. There were certain advantages that England's going to have. You can name three of them specifically. First advantage that Britain would have is they have a professional army, right? They're sending over a professional army, one of the best trained armies in the world, right? Secondly, Britain's population is about 4 times the size of the colonial population. We talked before about how the colonial population is increasing. Right? There's like 1.6, 1.7 million. But Britain has 4 times that. So if it's just about throwing manpower at it, Britain could outpace us in terms of the number of people. Right? That's a second advantage for Britain. Third advantage, Britain's Navy. Right? Britain has the best Navy in the world. Britain has used its Navy and will use its Navy to establish this massive empire it will have. Right? There will be one point in history where Britain rules over 1/3 of the entire planet. You hear the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And that was true, because there was always some place on the planet where the British flag is flying. Right? They had colonies around the world. So how are these farmers going to possibly compete with this? Right? The British were of the opinion that as soon as the real fighting starts, these Americans are going to turn tail. As soon as they hear that stomping coming, those soldiers coming up over the hill, right, the cavalry coming, right, as soon as one of those cannons go off, we're going to drop these muskets and we're going to go back to our farms and kind of tuck our tail between our legs. Right? Doesn't happen that way. Because there are certain American advantages too. What might be an American advantage, you think? What might be something that the Americans could play to in terms of their advantages? Yes.
They really utilize the terrain, like kind of fight dirty.
Okay, yeah. They know the terrain better. This is their home. Home field advantage. Plus, they're going to be willing to dirty it up a little bit. Right? If you're outgunned, if you're outmanned, you use what you have. Right? Use what you have. So you'll constantly hear British soldiers talking about these quote-unquote unmanly Americans. Right? They won't stand and fight. They won't stand in front of us and fight. The British have these traditional military tactics, right? Come up in a box formation. The first person gets down and shoots, and then the next guy waits and loads his rifle and steps forward. These Americans are like, I'm not standing in front of that. That's dumb. Why would I do that, right? So we'll do something like, tell you what, I'll be over here in the forest. When you come walking by on the road, me and my buddies here are going to pop out, pop, 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 disappear back into the forest. Right? All these stories about these unmanly Americans. They hopped out and ambushed us, and then they slinked back into the forest like cowards. We're like, no, not like cowards. Not like cowards, right? We killed you, went home, watched Game of Thrones, and we'll be back tomorrow to shoot you again. Right? Much of these tactics have been learned through the years of conflict with natives. Many of them have been borrowed from natives. So guerrilla tactics, right? Not standing in traditional formation when you're outmanned. We're going to use tactics that are not well suited for the British, that are well suited for somebody that's outgunned, outmanned. So you're right about this. And the home field advantage part of this is really significant too, right? Many times, nations that are technically more powerful will find incredible difficulties fighting someone that's fighting on their home turf. Right? We found this in our own history several times. Right? It's difficult fighting someone in their home turf, especially when they feel like they're defending themselves, their way of life, their families. Imagine you're in the top of the hill, right? You see these British troops coming, you're like, oh man, I don't really want to be here, right? They got those are big horses, and but then you look back over your shoulder, and your wife and child are like, good luck, Daddy. You can do it. I'm like, damn. All right. You know that if you lose, what's next? Your farm, right? Your family. So if those troops break through, what's going to happen to your family? You may fight to the death for that very reason, even though you want to run, even though you want to give up. Right? because it's about a larger idea. It's about something tangible and concrete. In addition to being about notions of freedom, it's literally about your imagined community. So it's going to make things difficult, I think, more difficult than the British would have suspected. There are going to be some other factors as well. The British would hire professional soldiers, these Hessian mercenaries, all right, sort of culturally German soldiers. So this is an advantage, right? The British can write a check and get thousands of soldiers, I think. This could be an advantage. But if you're a professional soldier fighting for someone else, a soldier of fortune, essentially, what's your motivation? The check. What do you not get if you get killed? The check. And so think about how that could be used against someone, right? If they're not really invested in it, perhaps they're not going to fight as hard as they might for their own cause. Right? So although these Hessian mercenaries will be used, perhaps that may be an advantage in some cases and a disadvantage in other cases. Now, despite all of this, the first battles are not going to go very well for the Americans. We take loss after loss. Right? We're on a serious losing streak. Right? A serious losing streak. The first years will not go well. In fact, George Washington will have a losing record during the American Revolution. Overall, he has a losing record. But as we know, it doesn't matter how you start. It matters how you finish. So despite the fact he has a losing record, he is going to win the big battles. He's going to win the final battle, which is going to be the most important, as we'll see. Now, why are we doing so poorly? Well, we talked about some of the reasons why it might be difficult, but there are other factors as well. The Continental Congress, right, our kind of rough draft at a government, has some limitations. Right? There's some obstacles involved. The Continental Congress has to beg each state legislature. Right? They have to beg them, essentially, for money to finance the war. And they're only rarely successful at getting the states to contribute their fair share. So imagine this: I'm the Continental Congress, and I pick up the phone and I text Virginia, right? Like, hey, Virginia, you're the largest state, the largest colony, not state, cutting state. We need you to send $1,000 by Wednesday. Right? Got reports there's some British soldiers heading this way. We need $1,000. Right? We're going to buy some muskets. Right? If we can get here by Wednesday at noon, that'd be great. Right? That'd be fantastic. Yeah, hello? Are you there? Did you hang up on me? So they call back and like, look, we need you to contribute your fair share. Well, there is no strong central government. There is no way to force Virginia to do anything. Right? They're asking them, hey, please send it. And Virginia often is like, and other states, like, you know what, let me check my bank account. So Virginia pulls up its online banking, and they're like, man, we don't got it. Tell you what, instead of $1,000 on Wednesday, I'll send you $500 next Friday. Right? Next Friday's payday. The Continental Congress is like, they're coming Wednesday. We need the money now. Virginia's like, look, I can't help you. Take it or leave it. Right? So, underfunded. The Army will be underfunded through most of the war. Washington's troops will often go without pay. Right? They're complaining about having to fight in the snow with no shoes and these sorts of things, frostbite and other issues. Right? They don't have basic supplies. They sometimes run out of munitions, right? Run out of food. So this is going to be a difficult logistical matter to deal with. And it's going to raise an idea in the minds of some that perhaps our governmental system is going to need some tweaking. Right? Now, the initial British strategy, right? The initial British strategy is to take New York. To take New York. Now, in many ways, this makes sense. Right? The British figured geographically that if they take New York, they could separate rebellious New England from rebellious Virginia. Right? They can separate North and South and cut those lines by taking New York. And they also know that there's a large loyalist population in New York. Right, so this might be a good strategy on several levels. And they do quite well early on. Right, they do quite well. They would take New York with ease, and they almost capture George Washington, right, who kind of has to sneak out of New York with the remnants of his army. They will push Washington back into New Jersey by August 1776. So imagine a month after we declare independence, Washington is on the run. He's kind of running for his life, maybe literally. right? Knowing that if he's captured, that's the end of the war, right? A month after declaring independence. Also knowing that once you declare independence, there is no going back. Right? We are now committing treason. What's the penalty for treason? Death. Right? As Ben Franklin says, right, when we are moving towards revolution, he says, look, fellas, we all have to hang together now, or we're all going to hang separately. He wasn't joking. Essentially, we got to hang together, or we're going to hang separately. That's going to be the penalty for treason. And so they know that there is no going back at this point. So by August 1776, right, Washington is on the run. He has to retreat back into New Jersey. He retreats further back over the Delaware into Pennsylvania, where he plans to spend the winter. He's like, okay, look, let's call a timeout. Let's wait for winter to end, and then perhaps do some things. Thomas Paine realized how bleak things were looking at this point. Right? We're suffering loss after loss. Winter is coming, right? And they're not just Game of Thrones fans. Thomas Paine would write of this time period. He says, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls." So he's basically like, look, it's about to get bad. We're going to see who's real and see who's not committed at this point. He says, these are the times that try men's souls. He said, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. He says, but he that stands now deserves love and thanks. So it's almost like a pep talk. Look, it's going to get bad, but just stick with it. Right? Stick with it. Winter will end eventually. All right, we'll get some dragon glass and we'll, And so how is this winter going to go? Well, some soldiers will, in fact, desert the army during this winter. Right? Some will, in fact, desert. Now, some of these guys are farmers, right? They pick up a gun and start fighting. Many of them are like, look, I'm going to fight to defend my house. I'm going to fight to defend my farm. But then some of them are, by winter are like, look, I've been fighting for 6 months now. I haven't seen my family. I'm fighting to protect my family. I don't know if they're okay. I'm going home. I don't care what they say. Right? Some folks will roll out. But most of them do not. Most of them do not, even as difficult as it's going to be during the winter. And George Washington is often credited with a lot of the credit for keeping this army together. Right? Washington is one of these heroic figures of the time for many. He's a big guy, just physically speaking. He's like 6'4". Right? This is the time when I would have been tall. Right? Men are like 5'6". So to have this like 6'4" rich guy on top of a white horse, right, riding up to you, it seemed imposing in many ways. In addition, Washington treated his men very well. Right? His men loved him. They followed him because of the way he treated them, and certain things that he would do, I think, to try to keep morale going and to endear himself to his men. For example, one of the things that was customary was that in wintertime, generals could leave the army and go back home. Right? For R&R, they can go back home and recuperate. Go sit by their fire, right? Hang out with their wife and kids, and then come back in spring and say, okay, we ready to go? Right? Whereas the men are, hunkered down somewhere trying to make it through the winter. Washington decides not to do that. Right? He could have gone back to Virginia, where it's warmer, right, and hung out and got things together. He chooses to stay with his men. And so many of the men will look at him as, this is obviously a positive thing in terms of morale. It was a well-calculated move as well. He kind of knew that this was perhaps a tipping point. Right? So again, some soldiers do desert, but Washington's army will remain intact. But even George Washington knows, look, we need some victories. We need at least a symbolic victory if we're going to keep this thing going. We're suffering loss after loss. So wanting to deal at least one blow to the British before the full onset of winter, Washington's troops would quietly cross the Delaware River again on Christmas night, 1776. So they kind of sneak across Christmas night, 1776, and they will catch some Hessian mercenaries in camp sleeping. Right? They catch them off guard, and they're able to launch a surprise attack in Trenton, New Jersey, 1776. They get a victory. Right? So this is good for morale in terms of the men. They get a victory. Even though they're not able to kind of make a string of victories of this, they at least know they can win. Right? They at least know they can win. And these and other subsequent victories are not going to last long, but they at least have in their mind that it's possible, especially before the onset of winter here. So after spending the winter at Princeton, New Jersey, the Continental armies will meet several defeats during the spring and summer of 1777. Washington's second winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania will be horrible. Right, there are all these stories from the soldiers about suffering frostbite. Right, there's disease that's going to run rampant among the soldiers, and many will die in camp at Valley Forge. Many will freeze. Right, but again, the army will remain intact. Right, it will remain intact, and we're going to have one important battle coming up that some see as a tipping point, perhaps, in the entire conflict. That's going to be the Battle of Saratoga. Right, Battle of Saratoga, Saratoga, New York, which happens in 1777. Why is it important? Well, this battle at Saratoga, New York, will signal to some of the other nations of Europe that maybe we can actually win this thing. We've been holding on, we've been hanging on, not getting knocked out of the conflict, but we haven't really shown that we can win. We're trying to get some other folks to help us out and to join us, in particular France. Right? France has been kind of financing some arms deals for us. In fact, Ben Franklin spent the entire war years in Europe, not in the colonies. Ben Franklin is over first in England and then hanging out in France, negotiating arms deals, right? Kind of getting cozy with the various power brokers. The French ladies love Ben Franklin for some reason. I don't know what it is. The short little dumpy look, I don't know what it is about us short dumpy guys, but ladies like us. But anyway, Ben Franklin is doing quite well, right? He's actually gotten some arms deals and such. But Saratoga is going to be useful because it shows France that we can actually win. Now remember, Britain and France have a rivalry, right? They don't like each other so much. They're constantly fighting. So when France feels like they might have an opportunity to weaken their rival by backing these Americans completely, they will take advantage of that. But they don't want to be on the losing side. They don't want to back a loser. Right, so Saratoga is going to be important because it will signal to France, Britain's chief rival, right, that these Americans may actually have a chance to win with the right support, with the right help. So the French will decide to help us completely beginning in 1778. Right, the French Navy will come to bear on England. Right, French officers will come over and help train these American troops. So with the French aid, this changes the nature of the conflict. Some say it makes it into a world war, essentially. Why? Well, because if France and England are at war in the colonies, they're also at war in Europe. France has Caribbean colonies, so does Britain. So that means that England has to be on guard everywhere for French attack. They have to send troops and part of the Navy perhaps to guard Caribbean colonies to keep from losing, say, Barbados or Jamaica or some of the other colonies they may hold really important. So it makes it essentially a world war. It kind of makes Britain spread its forces a bit thinner. So this is really important. This is really important. In addition, the French Navy will be quite helpful. So not only do they have to fight in North America and the Caribbean, but they're fighting in Europe as well. Now, although the war would drag on throughout 1779, it's going to drag on throughout 1780, the British will change strategy, change tactics, and try to consolidate their forces in the South. They will come up with the idea that if they can knock Virginia out, then they can still win the conflict. However, the British general will make a miscalculation, and a large contingent of British troops will be forced to surrender at Yorktown, Virginia. So basically, several thousand British troops get surrounded. The American troops might be in behind them, and behind the troops is the ocean, the water. The French Navy will sail in and start bombarding them. So they have to surrender. Several thousand British troops will have to surrender at Yorktown in October 1781. And with the exception of a few small battles, this is the end of the war. Right? This final battle at Yorktown is really it. The British and the Americans will begin peace negotiations, and the Treaty of Paris of 1783 will recognize American independence. Will recognize American independence. Now, sometimes you have to be careful what you ask for, right? Sometimes you're working towards a goal, and then you get it, and you got to figure out, okay, what do I do with it now, right? We've been imagining this community for a while, but now we get it. What now? What is this nation going to look like? And this is kind of the question for the rest of our clash, right? What is it going to look like? How are we going to imagine it and make it real in a sense? Right? With the war over, these Americans now have to turn their attention to other matters. And there are already problems that have emerged, right? We think about some of the problems of fighting the conflict, right? There are already problems that have emerged that have to be dealt with, or that will have to be dealt with for the young nation. For example, in 1777, the Continental Congress had adopted something called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation it's basically a rough draft of a constitution, basically. It's going to be kind of a rough draft of a governing system for us. Now, although the Articles were not formally ratified by the states until 1781, they really had been our unofficial constitution throughout the war years. They get us through the war. Right? They get us through the war. But there will be several problems with the Articles of Confederation. Right? There are going to be several problems. Yes, there are successes. It worked. It got us through the war. But there are already some problems that we've already seen. Right? The Articles created what they called a loose league of friendship. A loose league of friendship between the states. Right? So it basically said, okay, all the states are friends. We're all friendly. We're all equal. We're all friendly. But it does not create a strong central government. Right? It was a loose league of friendship, but not a strong central government. Now we know why we did not want a strong central government at the time. We were currently fighting against a strong central government. Right? Federal power we felt was oppressive, and so we're not going to put another system in its place that looks just like the king we were currently fighting. Right? So this is why the Articles look the way that they look. But we've already seen some of the problems of not having kind of central authority, not having a strong enough sort of federal component to this. Remember, under the Articles, Congress will not have the power to levy direct taxes. Congress can't get taxes. They have to beg each state for taxes in the same way that the Continental Congress had to beg each colony for money to fight the war. Many times a state would just say no, and would refuse, or sometimes they send less than was requested. Sometimes they send it late. This is the reason why, again, those soldiers had such difficulty financing the war. They're often poor, poorly clothed, malnourished, so on and so forth. In addition, the Articles does not give Congress the power to regulate relationships between the states. It doesn't give Congress enough power to regulate relations between the states. So, for example, Virginia and Maryland sharing a border. Now, as we're fighting England, there is one common enemy. Everybody knows who the enemy is. Okay, let's pull together, let's fight. But once that enemy is removed, the states start to fight each other. You have the threat of border wars. Right? What if Virginia's like, the border's here. Maryland's like, no, it's not. It's 10 miles over there. That's our territory. This could start civil war. Right? So you have all these threats of border wars. States are so independent from each other that each state is printing its own paper money. How are you going to have a national economy when you have 13 colonies, now 13 states, printing their own currency? How much is it worth? Right? Say you're a merchant in Virginia and you go across the border to Maryland, they're like, that money's not worth anything here. This is going to be an issue for a young nation. Remember, some argue that even when we get independence, that we should form 13 different nations rather than one United States. Some thought the colonies were so different and distinct from each other that you couldn't have one nation. You couldn't have one imagined community. So I think this is a very real issue that's going to have to be dealt with, right? It's a very real issue. The Articles of Confederation did not provide for a president or for a chief executive of any type or for federal courts. There's no president under this system. Who's going to make these decisions? There is no executive branch in that sense. So again, while the war was going on, these rivalries are kept in check, right? Imagined community is working in that direction. But once it's over, this question of national unity becomes a serious concern. Right? Becomes a serious concern. Without a strong central government, these rivalries are threatening to destroy the young republic. Historians call this the critical period. We're not sure if we're going to make it. We're not sure if we're going to make it through these years. Now again, despite the fact that the Articles have some problems that have to be addressed, there are some successes under the Articles of Confederation. There are some successes for the young nation. First of all, the Treaty of Paris itself, right? The treaty with England actually goes better than we thought. We get more than we thought we would from the Treaty of Paris in 1783. It's much more generous. For example, not only does Britain recognize American independence, but we also are ceded or given large tracts of land. Right? We get vast territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. So literally, the nation grows as it's being born. Right? The nation is growing as it's being born. But this raises some questions, right? And this is going to be some of the questions we'll get to next week. What is this going to look like? Right? What's this nation going to look like? What is this new territory going to look like? How are we imagining this new community? They have to start making these decisions right away. Now, for example, there are going to be two sort of sets of rules and regulation passed about this new territory. One is going to be the Land Ordinance of 1785, and the other is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So the Land Ordinance of 1785 contained rules for the creation of townships in the Northwest Territory. And it contains rules for kind of carving out townships. I lived in Pennsylvania for about a decade, and Pennsylvania has a township system. Ohio may have a township system as well. So I lived in Baldwin Township, which was about 7-8 miles from downtown Pittsburgh. Right? But it's its own township. It's separate. So LA is a little different in terms of how it's carved out. But this kind of creates, it's beginning to create how this territory is going to look, even before it's a state, even before it's largely populated. So the Land Ordinance sets up rules for the creation of townships in the Northwest Territory, which is the area north of the Ohio River. It even provided public support for education there. So they're thinking about the future already, right? What is this place eventually going to look like? And we have to have some rules to begin to set this up. Now, just as important is the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 lays out how states would eventually be created out of this territory. What are these states eventually going to look like, right? Get out the ruler and start drawing on the map. So it creates states, it guaranteed basic rights, and it does something really important moving forward. The Northwest Ordinance will forbid slavery in this territory. It's going to forbid slavery in this territory. Now, this is going to be really important because it's sort of setting a precedent. Some say it's drawing a line that says, okay, look, we should not allow slavery to expand, especially in the North. Right on the Revolution, slavery is starting to die out in the North. Remember, it had been national, but it's dying out first in the North. And I think this Northwest Ordinance containing this provision forbidding slavery says something about how they were imagining their future, perhaps. Now, Southerners are like, wait a second, why are you saying we can't have slaves in any part of the nation, right? What does that mean? What does that say? So I think this is going to be a question that we'll have to answer moving forward. In 1786, Shays' Rebellion will illustrate many of the problems and difficulties of the Articles of Confederation and the need to do something a little different. Right? Shays' Rebellion will happen in western Massachusetts in 1786. Some say that it illustrates the main problems with the Articles of Confederation. Who's Daniel Shays? Daniel Shays is a veteran of the Revolutionary War. Right? He helped create the United States. But then Daniel Shays goes home to western Massachusetts and looks around, and he's like, what in the world did I help create? Where's my American dream? Because he goes home, and like many of the small farmers around him, Shays is heavily in debt. He's about to lose his farm to creditors. So imagine you go off to fight, and then you come home, and you got an eviction notice. It's like, well, wait a second. I built this, right? Literally. How is this possible? Where's my American dream? He and others will feel like the laws of the state are too much in favor of the creditors, too much in favor of the bankers and the businessmen, and not in favor of the small farmers. He feels like the little guy's getting swallowed up, and that he and his other veteran friends should do something about it. So as they watch people get thrown in debtors' prisons, as they watch people lose their farms, they decide that, you know what, maybe the revolution isn't over. Maybe the revolution isn't over yet. And they will lead a series of attacks on local courthouses to prevent foreclosures. They shut down the courts so that the courts can't foreclose on farmers' farms. Now, this is a rebellion. This is essentially almost a civil war in the young nation, some will argue. As the rebellion grows, it becomes clear that neither the Congress has the power or the state of Massachusetts have the power and the money to raise a militia to deal with Shays' rebellion. Who's going to stop this guy and the 1,000 or so soldiers he might already have at this point? So, if the Congress doesn't have the money, the state of Massachusetts doesn't have the money to raise a militia, who's going to pay for it? What happens is a private army has to be put together by many of the elites that are afraid that this could spiral out of control. Shays and his followers will eventually be defeated after they attack this. They want to attack the Springfield Armory, get all the guns there, and essentially make this another revolution. Eventually, they will be defeated. But the fact that the central government was too weak to do anything about the rebellion indicated to many people there's a need to make a change in the Articles of Confederation. That it's not working. So on September 1786, a group of leaders will assemble in Annapolis, Maryland, to address this problem. However, only 5 states show up. So they call a meeting of 13 states, only 5 show up. This is how ununified they are. Disunified, I guess is the word. So they adjourn the meeting for a year. The next year, they will call a meeting again in Philadelphia in the spring. And this meeting will be known as the Constitutional Convention. Eventually, what comes out of this is going to be our Constitution. We initially think that we are just going to make some small revisions to the Articles of Confederation. Pretty quickly, it becomes clear that an entire new document will have to be created. And so we'll see how this Constitution takes shape from these events.